It's my pleasure to be joined today by Mr. Patrick Cockburn, Middle East Correspondent for The Independent, renowned war correspondent over the years, and perhaps member of the most decorated journalist family that I've ever heard of, certainly perhaps ever in the English-speaking world. So thank you for joining me today. I'd like to ask you firstly about journalism in general. You talk a lot in the book about oversimplification and how Western media tend to take a really basic outlook at often very complex events. What's your advice to people like me who are budding journalists to try and have a real in-depth, multifaceted view like yourself? Do I have to be there? Do I have to live it?
I think a lot of it's very simple. It's just, don't do that, Realize that, life is multifaceted. Don't totally demonize one guy, even if he's a demon, Like Saddam Hussein was pretty demonic, but he wasn't the only thing wrong with Iraq, nor Gaddafi of Libya or Assad of Syria. But the sort of demonization of single rulers, is very misleading for anybody whom one's trying to communicate with. But also very bad, I think, for, opposition within these countries, because I think we get rid of Saddam, everything will be okay. And of course, we know it wasn't. It was never likely to be. Some of this is difficult to do. You should be there. But some of it, I think, is quite easy, which is just to approach it with a skeptical, open, non-partisan, skeptical mind. And whoever tells you something, they tell it to you for a reason. It's always partisan. Doesn't mean they're lying, but that's the truth as they see it.
Right.
But you need to, see a diversity and always be skeptical about that. Now, this sounds incredibly obvious. It is incredibly obvious, but then you can look at whole screeds of journalism, and they're all, all the sins come from one source. All the mistakes come from. The other thing is, sources. If you look at the New York Times, it's always sources are revealing to the New York Times. So why do they reveal things to the New York Times? Because it's in their interest. That isn't admitted. It gives a picture of a world which are full of these saintly characters who tell you secret or confidential information. They don't. They're doing it, for reasons which seem good to them, often to do with their own career, often the betterment of their own organization. Again, it's not, why does this happen? Well, I think journalists don't really want to admit they're often a conduit of information that others are putting out. They want to feel that they're somehow getting the truth.
Right. And does it still anger you? I imagine since sort of the haziness of like 9/11 and that, or since at least maybe perhaps Bush's second administration when lies were revealed and everything, do you think people's views are starting to kind of correlate more with yours? They have a more skeptical attitude, as you say they should?
To a degree, and one would hope they should, because, there's an invasion of Iraq, they get rid of Saddam Hussein, the subsequent history of Iraq has not been good, whatever side you're on.
Right.
But along comes Libya, and they do exactly the same thing. They get rid of Gaddafi, and look at the state of Libya today. It's run by these criminalized warlords. Likewise in Syria. So there doesn't seem to be a learning curve, certainly among governments. To some degree, maybe there is among public, but, I wonder, journalists, certainly in Libya, were not very skeptical about what would replace Gaddafi, or whether anything would replace Gaddafi.
Or whether they had a plan at all.
Or were there guys to have a plan, or were these, these gunmen, who did they represent? It's partly, PR has developed. I remember in Benghazi in Libya, there was, there was a spokesman for the opposition who spoke excellent English, very civilized woman, and so forth. Then when the opposition, transitional government came later in 2011 to Tripoli, I remember the first thing they announced was they were abolishing Gaddafi's ban on polygamy.
I read that.
You could tell where these guys were coming from. So I think that there needs to be sort of, obviously there needs to be skepticism, but I'd like to think there was a learning curve, but you can't quite see it.
Right. And this discrepancy that's just been there almost your entire career between you and Western intelligence, is that down mainly to their self-interest? I mean, do they know these things and keep it to themselves, or is it really just as much of a con as...
I don't know the answer to that, some things seem so obvious, and yet they did them anyway. Sometimes it emerges subsequently that there were guys in intelligence who were saying, warning about Islamic State in Iraq and Syria in 2014, but nobody listened to them, or so they say. 2003, it turns out there were loads of people in Britain and America, high up in the government and the civil service, who thought it was a really bad idea to invade Iraq and so forth. But, they say that now, but did they really say it then? And did they do anything about it?
Yeah. And what are the limitations of war journalism? I mean, it's hard for me to know. I mean, I know we can definitely influence the academic world, but what's on these victims that you describe in the Middle East, the real sufferers of the conditions? How could we help them?
First of all, what do journalists do? You find out something, you tell the public about it. That's it, really. That's 95% of it. So you try and tell the truth. I mean, it sounds goody-goody, and but it's not that easy. So I think one tries to do that, and then one tries. One shouldn't used to be pompous about this. People talk about being the voice of the voiceless and stuff like that. I find that a bit patronising, but put in simpler terms, I do try to sort of report on terrible things that happen that people don't know about. Mm-hmm. I'd like to do it more. Yemen. One knows all these terrible things are happening, bombings. Some of these get publicity, most don't. But I try to do that. And try to tell people things that they wouldn't know otherwise. I mean, a lot of these things are easy to state, but they aren't necessarily easy to do.
Yeah.
And also, try to knock down things that one thinks are exaggerated and untrue, like we're talking about Libya, that during the Libyan War, perhaps more than most, there were tremendous, high-profile atrocity stories, that Gaddafi ordered the mass rape of women, in opposition areas, and this was widely broadcast and did a lot to get support for the overthrow of Gaddafi. Now a woman had claimed that she'd distributed. Can you imagine in the middle of war? I think it was 70,000 questionnaires distributed in eastern Libya in the middle of war. 50,000 are returned. You wouldn't get that in Hampstead. And all these people claim that they've been raped by Soviets. Then this is widely reported, but then not just me, but human rights organizations, Amnesty, go to the woman and say, could we see some of these? She doesn't have any of them. Could they get any of the names of these people? No, she can't do that. It becomes apparent to everybody that this is an invention. It's just simply not true. But, of course, the people who invent these things, and somebody sits down, these things that really don't happen by accident, knows, but by the time they're discredited, they've done their work. And this goes back a long time. I remember, you recall 1990, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. I mean, a really bad thing to do. But then one of the stories that really got people upset was a woman who claimed she was in a hospital in Kuwait. She was a Kuwaiti, and Iraqi soldiers had gone into the unit in the hospital where there were babies in with special facilities, and tipped up babies out onto the floor. Horrific stuff. Except she turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington. She'd never been there. It didn't happen. Right.
Pretty shocking. And in terms of a source for that Libyan lie, do we know where that source?
Well, a woman invented it. First of all, I don't know how it was. Some of these things have the feel that somebody who had an agenda sat down and thought, this is what I'm going to do.
Right, it just seems like such an extravagant
that it
lie.
Isn't just, it might be, but isn't just, an individual who decides to concoct this story to make a point. Exactly. I think it's a bit simple-minded to imagine the world works like that.
Well, the way the world's currently working, as you describe it, is that there are 8 or 9 ongoing wars in the region from, I think you describe it as, is it the western Pakistan border all the way till North Africa? What, I mean, we're talking obviously about Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, North Sudan. Is that included as well in your account?
Sudan, yeah. It's particularly the war in South Sudan. It's, I mean, at that point you begin to get towards Central Africa, so it's slightly different. But,
yeah. And out of this kind of like melee, this of violence, is there something like an event that in your lifetime you would like to see that would reinstill some kind of optimism? Perhaps like demilitarization of Assad's regime, defeat of ISIS, something that you think might turn the table slightly towards a more positive outlook? Or is it too complicated for that?
Because I think ISIS was sui generis. I think it, it depended on sectarianism. It deliberately fueled sectarianism. The way they'd work in Baghdad and elsewhere would be, you might have some district with some ISIS guys there. They'd go and kill some Shia in a neighboring district. The Shia would, in a probably pretty atrocious way, the Shia would come back and kill some Sunni in that area, and then people in that area would have no alternative but to look to ISIS to defend them.
Yes.
So they were continually provoking and exacerbating sectarianism. And you could see that on a small scale they did with assassinations, but also massacres of hundreds, thousands of people. So I think the elimination of ISIS is very important. I think, Syria, I don't think we're going to get demilitarized Syria. I'm not going to get demilitarized Iraq, but it is important just to get the level of violence down, to have ceasefires. You've got to. It's very easy to say, I wish for this, but it should be attached to what's really attainable. Right. And I think if you could get more, you get ceasefires in Syria, even if it's like old Lebanese ceasefires. There might have been 600 ceasefires during the Lebanese civil war, which was 15 years, and people used to laugh at them, and so forth. But generally, less people got killed during ceasefires than at other times. Right. And I think it's necessary because I think you can't. All these other ideas people have about power sharing and so forth, you can't do that when people are trying to kill each other. It's what in Northern Ireland we used to call the politics of the last atrocity. You had atrocities that determined the agenda. You couldn't really compromise or negotiate or anything else. Right. So you need to get that down. That in itself, to a degree, demilitarized politics as well. Other people could join in. When you've got a war, the guys who determine the agenda, determine what goes on, tend to be the toughest fighters, the most committed, the guys who are prepared to get killed. Who are they in Syria? They're ISIS, they're al-Nusra.
Well, that's why. Are they prepared for a ceasefire? How would one negotiate?
For them. You say this is a big question. We had this failed ceasefire recently in this September. It failed, for a number of reasons that maybe it was never going to do it. But, one of the reasons was there was nothing in it for al-Nusra.
Right.
Nothing in it for ISIS, but, that moderate armed opposition was supposed to separate themselves from al-Nusra. But actually one knows that it can't really be done because the Islamists dominate the armed opposition.
Right. More so today, am I correct in saying? I think today I read some news about an Islamist opposition joining forces with non-Islamist opposition.
Yeah, they do it because, one, they'd probably get killed if they didn't. And secondly, al-Nusra is popular,
Right.
These aren't, ISIS is often unpopular, but because of their savagery and so forth. But often al-Nusra is popular in these areas. These groups, one, it would be very dangerous to move away from al-Nusra. But secondly, these are the guys they've been fighting alongside. They're brothers in arms.
Right.
It's not purely intimidation that they join up. That they kind of believe in the same thing.
Yeah. And you touched there on sectarianism. I know for a fact. My parents, coming from where we discussed off camera earlier, coming from Iraq in the 1970s, they seem to hold the view that a lot of moderate Muslims do, that this Shia Sunni thing arose out of nowhere, that it's this new kind of thing rather than an ancient struggle as others seem to try and paint it. What's your view on that?
First of all, you always had differences between Sunni and Shia. They were destroying Shia mosques in Baghdad, in the year 1000, in Al-Qadimiyya, and, in villages, you had Sunni villages, Shia villages. People didn't live together, so there were differences. But the sort of acute sectarianism, is modern. Where did it come from? Well, a number of sources. The Iranian Revolution. Initially, they mainly saw this as pan-Islamic, but then during the Iran-Iraq War, it became pan-Shia, really. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan set off sort of Sunni jihadis. But perhaps, just as important is the way in which Wahhabism has come to dominate or influence mainstream Sunni Islam. This wasn't true 100 years ago or 80 years ago. And it's done it because it's backed by Saudi money. The Saudi state and the Wahhabi clergy have always historically been dependent on each other and still are. So, you want to set up a small mosque in Bangladesh and you need $20,000. There's only one place you can go.
Of course. Where
are all these people trained, So I think that is a big change, and Wahhabism, it's not quite the same as the ideology of Islamic State, but it's al-Nusra, but it's not far away.
Salafi, Wahhabi.
Salafi, jihadi beliefs. Yeah. And I think that is a big change, and that has exacerbated sectarianism.
Yeah. Now, you did say, right, that there's only two places in the world that women can't drive. It's Islamic State and Saudi Arabia.
Sure, yeah. In the House of Saud, they probably feel, some of them feel they can use the Wahhabis, but get rid of them when they want, and the Wahhabis feel the same thing about the House of Saud. I doubt if either can do it.
Right. And in terms of British foreign policy towards this melee, how would you like to see it change? Do you think we're going to see troops in Syria at any point? Do you think we're going to see troops back in Iraq at any point? Is that something you'd like to see?
There's no public support for this, quite the opposite.
British public support,
British public support, yeah. And there isn't American public support either.
Yeah.
But I suppose if there were some, terrorist attacks in central London, this might change, same in America.
Right.
It's not there at the moment. Also, these foreign intervention create a lot of these problems. More foreign intervention will create more of these problems in different ways. You look at the American-British intervention in Iraq 2003, but look at the American intervention in Lebanon in 1982. Or the Israelis, what happened there? There's a counter-reaction very soon. So, British foreign policy, what is it? It seems to sort of kind of go along with what the Saudis and Turkey and the Gulf Sunni states want.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem very enterprising. This day that we're talking on, Boris Johnson said he'd like to see people demonstrating outside the Russian embassy.
Yeah, making a full 360 on his own. He made a full 360.
Well, it's entirely different what he said previously,
yeah.
But leave that aside. When foreign ministers were accused for calling for demonstrations, that they don't have anything new to say themselves.
Right. Yeah. And I imagine American foreign policy is going to take some changing now, perhaps. What do you think about the presidential run? I know that in the second debate they mentioned briefly very vaguely their approaches to Syria, with Clinton saying that she's going to resume Obama's way of militarizing the Iraqi Kurds, also insinuated that she's going to militarize the Syrian Kurds, to Turkey's dismay. Donald Trump says he's a fan of the Kurds. What do you think? What are the dangers of that?
It's safe to say you love the Kurds until you betray them,
Yeah.
And the Kurds know that. The Kurds are in a peculiar position because they've done pretty well as our boys, the West's boys, the ground troops, with Western air power backing them up. But they've also, in Iraq, they've taken over disputed territories disputed with Arabs. That's increased the Kurdish-controlled area by about 40%. And similarly in Syrian Kurdish areas, that in northern Syria, a lot of this was, there are a lot of Arab villages, Arab places there that the Arabs have been pushed out or have left. And they know there are only about 2.2 million Syrian Kurds. They're in a very vulnerable position. If the war ends, if ISIS disappears, if Damascus is back, that's dangerous for them. If the Turks, that's another enemy. And they depend on having the US and others as their allies. But if there's no more ISIS, then what's the point of that alliance to the Americans, you know? And there are 2 million Syrian Kurds, and there are 80 million people in Turkey. So, you know, they wonder what the long-term outcome of this is going to be.
Yeah. And this kind of demonization that you spoke of earlier of a demon in Saddam Hussein, are we doing that again now with Russia, Iran, Syria? That axis. Are we?
Sure, yeah.
Is that so? That
Sure,
continues that narrative.
Yeah, and you know, the calls, you know, to shoot down Russian aircraft. These things aren't going to happen. I mean, they're kind of childish. But unfortunately, they sort of prevent discussion of real things to prevent people getting killed. You know, how do you know? Can you evacuate the civilian population from
Mosul?
From Mosul, from Aleppo? You know. Then again, you know what's happened to the Russians in East Aleppo. They're obviously bombarding. They're obviously killing a lot of civilians. But hold on a minute. You know what happened to Ramadi? You know, the biggest city in Anbar province in Iraq. You know that there's nothing left. You know, it's destroyed. Fallujah, some people are going back. You know, but I think that just by sort of blaming it all on the Russians, the Syrian government, you know, this is very sort of juvenile.
Yeah.
And in a way, you know, the whole Western, you know, British policy is sort of based on myths, you know, that somehow we don't have to choose between Assad and the Islamists, extreme Islamists, because there are these armed moderates, you know, 70,000 of them, according to David Cameron. You know, and you have journalists and others who talk about this as real. You know, the one thing I've always noticed, though, is people who say that there are these Syrian armed moderates. These guys, if they're powerful, they must control territory. They never actually go to territory in Syria held by these people. Why don't they? Because they know they'd end up in the boot of a car immediately. They get kidnapped. Because they don't hold any territory. They're not there.
I suppose it's a deep human feeling of needing to take a side. Is that perhaps the reason?
Taking a side, but herd instinct as well, you know. It's kind of perhaps safer to say that, you know. A lot of this is herd instinct. But in Syria, it's sort of a little depressing from the point of view of journalists. People have whole articles, you know, based on secondary sources, you know, citizen activists they've never met, they know over the internet or in East Aleppo or somewhere else. They're not actually there. But they're much more certain about what's happening than people who have been in different parts of Syria. I've been in different parts of Syria, but you know, I'm very uncertain a lot of the time what's happening.
Yeah.
You find these people who are completely certain about what's happening, they're wholly partisan, but they're never actually been, you suddenly discover they've never been to Syria. They haven't been there for 5 or 6 years.
Right.
I mean, the parallel. I was saying to somebody actually in Syria, you know, it'd be rather like trying to. The BBC was reporting the presidential election in the US with their correspondent based in Canada, and his main source was the Trump campaign. You know, this would not be very accurate.
And his output would be he's certain that Trump is going to win the election, right?
It's Trump will be in there with a chance, yeah.
Did you ever consider abandoning your job, perhaps in a situation of particular danger?
You know, it's not. You know, first of all, you know, I try and limit the danger, and I've always found it's actually quite easy to be brave if you're not with your family. You've got your family or your children with you, then you really get frightened. I remember a guy in a friend of mine in Beirut during the war. Same one you know. I was partly living in Beirut at the time, late 70s, early 80s. But he said, once you move here permanently, it's not as dangerous, people say. He said, one thing, you can't bring your family with you. So that every time you hear a bang, you think it's your kids have just been blown up.
Right.
But of course, people who live there, they have to live with that. Their family, their children are there. That's far worse. It's dangerous. It's not. I used to think the young journalists who get killed because they don't want to make their name. Actually, it's older journalists who tend to get killed because they get blasé. They think
Right.
they've been doing it so long.
One more.
You get away with it 99 times out of 100, but the 100th time you don't. You know?
Yeah. And how have your political views managed? How have they held up throughout all these years? Have you become more radical in one way or another, or how have they morphed?
I think they probably have. I mean, my sort of skepticism about anything that governments do has probably increased, certainly since 2000. Since 2001, this book I've just done is really the Afghan War from 2001, then the Iraq War 2003, and the wars in Iraq, then it changed a little bit 2011, more moves to Syria, Libya, other places. The degree to which governments were responsible for this, the degree to which they acted wholly in their own interests, I think it's become more disgusting as time goes on, particularly in Syria. There are things they could have done to prevent it getting so bad.
Is it more disgusting or more transparent to us all now, perhaps?
I suppose so, but I'm not sure. I mean, everybody blames Tony Blair in Britain for the invasion of Iraq and so forth. But, David Cameron never seemed to get blamed for his actions in Libya, which destroyed Libya. Right. He probably played more of a decisive role in Libya than Tony Blair did in Iraq. The Americans were going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Didn't really seem to damage him.
Yeah.
And current policy on Syria, seems to me completely bankrupt and has been bankrupt for some time, but it doesn't seem to damage the government very much.
Well, I'll conclude, Mr. Cockburn. This book was absolutely riveting. It's kind of like a diaristic guide starting from 2001 with the US-led invasion into Afghanistan and leading to the present day. I do have a final question, though. Somebody I know once told me that war correspondence was easier than regular correspondence because all you got to do is not die, and everywhere you go and everywhere you talk to is a story. What do you have to say to that?
Well, no, it's not really, because a lot of the time you're waiting around for things to happen, Once it is happening, to some extent, the story writes itself, But then if you're going to do it properly, you have to realise, it's not just the bang-bang, other things are happening, I covered the Iraq, the Afghan war in 2001. The thing that struck me, actually, there was very little fighting. You wouldn't have understood that from TV.
No.
Because people are meant to be covering the fighting, and so they don't say, well, actually, there isn't much fight. But I went from Kabul to Kandahar, and it's very clear the Taliban were going home.
Right. You said the same about Iraq, right?
Yeah, there wasn't much fighting then, but then it became more and more violent,
Sure.
So people have a certain conception of war, or what war is like.
Right.
And this is true not just of individuals, of television stations and editors and so forth.
It's dramatized. Dramatized, right?
It's drama and, so forth. But, the actual bang-bang is only part of it, It's an essential part, but there are other parts of it. Yeah. So to cover war in general, not just combat, but war in general, is very complicated and difficult.
Right. I'm sure it is. Thank you so much for speaking to me. It's an honor. Thank you.